I'm here with Professor Patrick Dodson, prominent Yawuru leader from Broome in Western Australia, and also the founding director of the Indigenous Policy and Dialogue Research Centre here at UNSW. So Patrick, with Prime Minister Julia Gillard's announcement this week of the formation of an expert panel to provide advice to the government on a referendum on constitutional recognition of Indigenous peoples at or before the next election, I'm curious to know that if you were on that panel, what kind of changes would you be advocating?
Well, firstly, I'd want to make sure that we had a decent process. I think to make the changes before you've got a good process in place is challenging in terms of getting the critical numbers of people to support a referendum. And how you frame the propositions that may go to vote is also critical. There are two things I think about or probably three things about the Constitution. One is there's the recognition issue where the Indigenous people are recognised in a preamble. That's one matter. And maybe we ought to just do that and get on with it. If that's, because that's not really substantive. Then there's the existing capacities within the Constitution, and I think there needs to be some serious analysis and research around what it is that has capacity there for Indigenous recognition and rights. And the third thing, of course, is the International Declaration on Indigenous Peoples' Rights, which needs to be incorporated into domestic law in this country at some point. And obviously how that now butts up against anything we might want to do substantively in the way of the constitutional change. So, and that may not necessarily mean an amendment to the Constitution, that might just mean amending the Constitution in a way where that particular international instrument has some real role to play in the way policies and affect Indigenous peoples when they're made by Parliament. So there's a lot of room for discussion, and I'd hope that we approach this in a more mature way than what I've seen to date, and that if there is division between the parties, then I don't think there ought to be proceeding with any kind of vote on this.
No, I agree with that. The chances of failure are much higher than the chances of success at this point, particularly if there is a decline in that bipartisan support.
Absolutely.
But so far some people have described this as nothing more than a political stunt and the convening of a panel as just another talk fest. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I think they're predictable responses. Australians tend to be cynical about many things that politicians do, and that might all be true in terms of it being a stunt or not. But I do think that the Prime Minister has approached this with a view to dealing with a serious issue that we've been beleaguered by throughout the whole colonisation of this country, and the lack of any real recognition of Indigenous peoples in this Constitution that is the foundation, seminal document that guides our democracy. So I do think that there is a degree of seriousness about it. The degree to which we want to go in changing the Constitution, I think, is something where there's a lot of argument about. And that's understandable as well. So I would hope we can arise to the challenge rather than simply slip back into the predictable forms of argument or positions that people would adopt to this. Given that our success with referendum in this country is not so astoundingly brilliant.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the stakes are very high with this. The Prime Minister has said that if this referendum doesn't succeed, we're unlikely to see another one like it, and you yourself have made similar comments. Can you explain why you think that is?
Well, I think Australian, and particularly governments, tend to take an attitude, whether they're Labor or Liberal or whether it's the sort of multi-mixed parties that run the country at the moment, take a view that once they've raised an issue in Indigenous affairs, if it doesn't get up, or even if it does get up with marginal achievement of the original objective, there's a tendency to say we've dealt with that issue and therefore let's rule a line under it and go forward. And I think that's really what the Prime Minister's saying. I mean, the Prime Minister's lifetime may not be coincidental with her period as Prime Minister. So parliaments change, and a new parliament might take a different view. So I'm not particularly daunted by that aspect of what she's had to say, but I do think it's a signal that we need to take this seriously and seize the opportunity that is being presented, even though that opportunity may well be minuscule in terms of the high levels of aspiration within Indigenous communities and within the broader society.
Because it's a very high bar that a referendum sets. Unlike in a general election, we need a double majority to get a referendum up, a majority of people in a majority of states.
Absolutely.
And an overall national majority, and that's one of the reasons why we've only succeeded in passing 8 out of the 44 referendum questions put to the Australian public. Interestingly though, the 1967 referendum, which did make some changes to the Constitution, thought to favour Indigenous peoples. I'm not quite sure it's played out that way, but that was the most successful referendum vote ever, with 97% of Australians voting in support of those changes. What do you think were the key factors in 1967, and how might we replicate those today?
Well, you had a couple of very extraordinary individuals prior and leading up to the 67 referendum in Faith Bandler and Jessie Street. A lady who's descended from the South Sea Islands and a non-Aboriginal lady who were tireless in drumming up public support for a recognition of Indigenous peoples and for some equality within this nation as citizens, not necessarily to diminish anything of the cultural identity of Indigenous peoples. So you had some remarkable people driving this. Now, at the moment, I don't see anyone in the public sector or in our society that's driving a particular position for a constitutional proposition. So they worked hard to create the momentum. They worked hard at getting bipartisanship across our political spectrum, and they made the question fairly simple. And that was really about, giving the federal government a power to make laws for any race. And the practical effect was to count the Indigenous people in the way we reckon the numbers for the Senate in each of the states. And obviously, popularistly, people say that was when Indigenous people became citizens, which is not the case, but it certainly has had that sort of history. The climate was right. I think we'd come out of the Depression. There was a whole lot of concern about the lack of Australia's response to Indigenous people's position. There'd been, of course, a petition in 1938 at the Day of Mourning here in Sydney, asking the Prime Minister then to appoint someone at the parliamentary level to be responsible for Indigenous affairs. So there'd been some movement around this question of the relationship of Indigenous people to the national parliament or to the politics of the nation. That had been working away. So 38 to 67 is a big gap, but Australians don't respond very quickly to Indigenous people's quest for justice in this country.
Well, maybe 67 to 2013 will be the right gap as well.
It could well be.
Of course, you've been working on some of these issues through the Indigenous Policy and Dialogue Research Unit, where we're researching new approaches to intercultural dialogue and to Indigenous policy making. We've been working together there for about 18 months now. What do you think has been achieved in that work so far?
I think there's a number of things. From a university point of view, I think we've achieved some successes in applications for research grants to deal with closing the gap and to deal with evidence-based research in policy making. We've created a little unit of people with a couple of PhD researchers. There's been obviously representations by various members of staff. We're beginning the process of a structured dialogue scenario planning exercise. The real success, I think, is the grappling around with how best to construct a new philosophical basis upon which a new relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples can be constructed, and then moving on from there further to how collectively as Australians we confront and deal with global issues. So it's terribly important that we deal with the legacies of our history, and the division and discord issues that arise, and create a better discourse about that. Rather than confrontationalist, let's look towards vision, let's look towards narrative, new narratives, let's look towards new ways of conceiving of ourselves in the space. And I think the unit is beginning to at least keep that keep that in the public domain as an important mechanism through which we might begin to converse with each other on a different level, in a different way. Other people are doing some of these things, and that's very laudable, and we need a whole range of people in Australia actually engaging in this. And our unit within the Social Policy Centre is a very important driver in seeking to keep alive the need for dialogue. Australians tend not to look too far beyond our shores for how to deal with domestic issues here. And for 200 years we've failed. And that's a serious question we should ask ourselves about why do we fail, and why is it that we continue to deal with Indigenous peoples as if they are some form of deficit within our society. Why don't we take a different approach and say, well, how can we appreciate the values and the insights that they have from a cultural and a spiritual relationship to land, but also through social and civic mechanisms that they've developed over thousands of years here. So the unit is really trying to not just be innovative for the sake of innovation, but I think, and not just be academic for the sake of being academic. It is seriously looking for change drivers that will help our nation gradually change its relationship with Indigenous peoples, but also its own internal relationship to the Constitution or to our societal behaviour, and be more inclusive about the diversities that exist here.
I guess we're hoping that our scenario dialogue project, which I guess is our flagship research project, will be one of those drivers, and the work on that project's getting very serious now. That project aims to bring together a diverse group of influential Australians who are going to be asked to work together to develop a set of possible future scenarios for how the future relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australia might unfold in the coming years. Why do you think that project is so important?
Well, I think firstly, Australians really don't have a clear vision of who we are. We either bask in the historical brave pioneers going out there to reshape and remould the nation and conquer the wilds, or we lord ourselves around failed military victories at Gallipoli and other places. We really have to start asking ourselves, what's the global Australian going to look like? And that requires dealing with our legacies in terms of Indigenous people, in terms of a whole range of other issues beyond Indigenous peoples, our use of resources, our ways of interacting with our neighbours to the north and in the Pacific, a whole way in which Australia needs to be repositioning itself and restructuring its own internal strengths, building on the strengths of those past things. But if we aren't constantly looking to change, not for the sake of change, but because change is so rapid today. When these guys drew up the Constitution in 1901, they were in a boat somewhere on the Hawkesbury River, finalising it. Now, you do this over an IT pad or something today, miles and miles apart. So the whole change dynamic is something that our Constitution hasn't quite caught up with, and we as citizens need to look seriously at a new modern form of Constitution that reflects who we are and what it is we want to be in going into the future.
It seems to me that the time is quite right for some of these discussions. We're about to host the very first National Indigenous Policy and Dialogue Conference, and 200 people have signed up to come along to that event. What are you hoping that conference will achieve?
Well, I suppose people would say universities have conferences every second day of the week. But I think in this case it's really about it's the new possibilities and the new relationships and exploring how they might, what they might look like, what might be the basis for that, and how might we go about trying to achieve some of that. We won't get all of that done in a conference, of course, but it will hopefully throw up ideas. It'll throw up some learnings from experience and obviously from academia. But ultimately, it's the beginning, I would hope, of a new way in which we can have these sorts of dialogues or discussions around complex issues and seriously start to focus on what is the forward vision rather than simply dwell in what has been the past. The past is an important component. Every time you look out of a high-rise building in Sydney, you can see the Sydney Heads, and you know that's where Captain Cook sails through. Well, that's fine, we all know that now, so let's get on from there. What is our future vision as a group of human beings, irrespective of our cultural differences, on the planet, in this part of the world, and how is it we can develop better civil society norms to cope with the many challenges we have. Rampant development of towns and cities, resource depletions, the need for other energy sources. There's a whole range of challenges beyond dealing with the legacy of a fairly poor relationship with Indigenous peoples. Why we haven't been able to deal with that is the serious question, but let's not dwell on why we haven't been able to deal with it. How might we want to deal with it, and what would it look like if we had dealt with it? And how do we go forward? So the conference will throw up some of those discussions and hopefully give us some insights into ways in which a future vision for Australia can be constructed, and linking that to the dialogue scenario work that we will do. That will obviously help contribute, I think, to also the further broader debate that will go on in the society about the constitutional reform, or about bridging the gap, or about any other public policy, the intervention of the Northern Territory. All of those sorts of issues are in need of a shake-up. And I think the conference won't do all of that, but it'll at least hopefully start to shift the opportunism and the optimism about the potential to really seriously impact future policy in Australia.
It seemed that around a decade ago we were more on the track than we perhaps are now, and that's going to be one of the things we focus on at the conference, is what has and what hasn't happened in the 10 years since the end of the formal reconciliation process, when Australians in their hundreds of thousands walked across bridges to demonstrate their support and enthusiasm for a different kind of future. What do you think went wrong, and how would you describe the 10 years since that time?
I think we allowed ourselves to fall into a false binary of symbolism and practical reconciliation, without anyone fully understanding that both of those things are capable of being achieved. We were led to believe that you had to have practical reconciliation around health and housing and employment and jobs and commercial opportunism, and that you shouldn't be dealing with things like recognition of Indigenous peoples, or how should the United Nations standards be incorporated within our domestic law or within our constitutional framework, or how we should contemplate some of the discussions around treaties or agreements that were seen as ephemeral and theoretical. It was a false binary, and I think we fell into the trap as citizens going down that direction, as if one was more important than the other. Both are very important for a nation, and I think the lack of capacity in the area of courage as a nation to actually confront or deal with some of the more harder issues led us to try and find the easy solution. So it's really about the Aborigines. It's never been about the Aborigines at all. It's really about the mainstream society, and it's really about both of those groups working towards a reconciliation. So I think what went wrong was a focus on Indigenous peoples, and therefore a focusing on the shortfalls in not being able to express the achievements of mainstream Australian society. And I think to some genuine people appalled at the lack of progress in health and education, the awful statistics in custody rates, and removal of children, which are at a higher rate now than they were when the deliberate policies are taking kids away. There are more young babies and young people in institutional structures now than there were ever before, on the basis of practical reconciliation and out of fears of violence and other things. So the vision of Indigenous peoples became askewed, and a rise of a more superiority view that the West, in terms of Australian West, and the mainstream had the answers and the solutions, and were no longer capable of tolerating deviations from that. So we have interventions in the Northern Territory where the responsibility for Indigenous peoples were moved back into the hands and control of bureaucrats and policing services and those sorts of individuals. Whereas the philosophy or the mantra was to give Aboriginal people responsibility. So we were again put back into the category of children, incapable of running and managing our own affairs, did tremendous damage to many of the Aboriginal leadership, and I don't mean those who get in the press, but the day-to-day mums and dads who hold responsibility for their families as well as their communities, who had been doing some wonderful work in caring and looking after those communities and thinking forward about education, all those things. They were just simply removed as if there had been an invasion. It's a bit hard for most Australians to understand that, but there'd been another country came and took over this nation and then rearranged it according to their set of priorities and ignored completely any sense of what our notions of democracy had been, or our notions of culture had been, or our notions of pride and symbols of those things being removed. So languages are being removed. People are being relocated into these awful places that they call, preferred towns or something, where they've got away from, and the knowledge is being severed that's essential to the connection of spirituality and country. So these are dynamics that are happening now under this awful intervention in the Northern Territory, and is being run out in other places, and like where I come from in the Kimberley, for instance. So Northern Australia is being targeted as an area where the full brunt of the assimilationist philosophy has to be implanted in order for Indigenous peoples to go forward. Now, we've done all of that for 200 years and it hasn't worked. So the need for a dialogue process around this is critical, and the University of New South Wales, through the unit we have here, is at least trying to get an arrest of that momentum or that direction to reconsider what are the better ways we can do this, and how can public policy be better informed that includes participation by the Indigenous leadership, not just that of the Bright Sparks in Canberra or any other place.
It's one of the things that strikes me so often when I talk with you, both your deep sense of frustration and disappointment. You've been in this struggle for a long time, and I see that and I hear that in what you say, and yet you also always bring this sense of hope and optimism, and this belief that it's worth having another go and it's worth trying something different. Where do you think that hope comes from, and how does that feed into your future vision for Australia?
Well, I think it comes from many directions. It obviously comes from my belief and commitment to Aboriginal people and my own people in particular, but generally to Aboriginal people, and my love for Aboriginal people. And I know that there is much about our society that is rich and that is not appreciated in the mainstream, despite this 200 years of living on the same continent together. And so there's a lot there that has not had the opportunity to be really appreciated in the mainstream of our society. And 20% of Australians live in remote Australia. So most Australians have got no idea about country or connections to country or that sort of spirituality. And so we've got to get 80% of our people in Australia reconnecting to country in order to understand why the richness of a spirituality that links to land and has sustained Indigenous peoples for thousands of years is so critical in this 21st century as we deal with greenhouse gases and global warming and other sorts of things. The other thing that's important is that injustice is not just the domain of Indigenous people. It's not something that we just experience. There are many other peoples in the world who are experiencing injustice and regimes that perpetrate that, and some of those are democratic regimes, of course. In Canada, for instance, and the native Canadian peoples are still battling with the legacy of their colonial experiences and are not much better off than we are, if they are even better off. And then we have people who, on a day-to-day basis, are innocent victims of the ever ongoing search for greater richness and greater exploitation of resources. The people in the small island states in the Pacific who are living on atolls that are no more than 3 metres above the sea level, but the seas are rising and they're going to lose their not just their homes, but they're going to lose, if they have to be repatriated, we as mankind are going to lose the world's greatest navigators who taught Captain Cook how to navigate. People out of Kiribati are one of those sorts of groups. So we have, there are a number of those issues that I suppose fundamentally my love for my people. I believe in the richness of this country. I think we are better than what we are capable of exhibiting at the moment. I think that we have a grand opportunity to always do better. We can look at South Africa, we can look at a whole range of other nation states who have got over their particular difficulties. And why can't we in this nation get something right after 200 years? Now, Australians are very smart. We contribute a lot in many spaces in the world. We've got to ask ourselves a serious question: why are Indigenous peoples being locked up? Just take one issue. Why are they being locked up at the levels that they're being locked up in this nation at this time? It's not because we're just criminal. There's got to be other reasons for this. So they're the issues that drive me to try and find answers, try to get dialogue around that, try to get the goodwill of others to focus on how we might improve and change the circumstances that gives rise to some of those awful statistics we see and some of the awful life experiences that we know people live on a day-to-day basis in the streets.
Well, it's a privilege to be working with you on those issues, Patrick, and it's a privilege to be speaking with you this morning. So thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you, Sarah. Fine.